I'm very excited to do this for you guys today. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Um, yeah, we're going to take a very broad look at how to put together your artist statement, and hopefully give you some tools to approach your artist statement. Even if you've already done one, actually, it's a very nice position to be in. You come at it with a critical eye, or if you're in the process of writing one as well. Let's start our presentation. So, uh, image on the screen. This is a experimental poet, Derek Bewley. You see the kind of collage, kind of a pile of words and letters. And I put that up there for a few reasons. First of all, I think it's really cool. Second of all, it might be how you feel when you try to write. You know, these words and letters swirling around, but it's hard to get a hold of them and put them where you want them to be. And finally, I put it there because it indicates how I want to come at this. I want to take an artistic approach to writing. So I hope I'm successful this way. I'm hoping that I'm presenting something that's not like your typical English class, grammar school lesson. So it's kind of my emblem for what we're up to in this webinar. So I guess the first part is to make a case on why you might want to do this. What good is an artist statement? How can you use it? Well, first of all, it's promotion. It's PR. You use it to sell yourself and what you do. Either you're selling yourself to a gallery to present you or to a graduate program. It's a form of selling. It's a form of saying what you do. You can use it on your website as well for that purpose. It's also something that is almost standard in most applications for grants, fellowships, and residencies. Even when you're applying to school, graduate school, for instance, it's very handy for that. Um, it's also good, and I'm hoping we have a few teaching artists on the call on the webinar today. It's it helps make what you do into an educational tool. It's the way to frame a performance or an exhibit in a way that it introduces, say, a new or young audience to what you do. So to be able to talk about what you do well is helpful in that regard. Related to that is education. You're teaching people about your art and what you do. And the last one is advocacy. And this is a slightly um, different way than you typically use the word advocacy. You hear advocacy as contacting your representatives and telling them, um, for instance, to support an arts program. This case, I'm kind of picking up on what Joe Fusaro, who presented last year on the webinar series, said. Someone asked the question, how do we sell the arts to administrators in schools? And his response was, first of all, when you're doing an arts program, such as an artist residency, open the door, invite people in. And his second point was, as artists, we have a responsibility to be able to talk about what we do so that people can see the value of what we do. So it is an advocacy tool. When those non-arts folks see the value of what you do, they're more likely to support it either, with resources or financially, or just support it in general. So those are the 5 reasons I could come up with. I'm sure there are more, but the point is it's useful and it's valuable. Okay, so I have some very bad news for you guys. I know writing an artist statement is a pain, but statements aren't things you write once and you're done. Statements need to be adapted to your audience. Imagine if you're writing for a highfalutin gallery, or if you're doing, say, a play at a community center. Your language, your approach is going to change because your audience is different. Situation, likewise, can be different. If you're publishing in a magazine that's known for its high-powered conceptual discussion, it's going to be different than when you have an exhibit at the library. And your purpose, you might be just trying to pull people into your work and make them look a little more closely, or you may need to explain a lot. It depends on what you want to do in that particular situation. So there's no such thing as one size fits all. So it's not one statement, but many. I know that's bad news. Actually, what it is really it's many variations. So you get a core statement and you'll be able to adapt it. But keep in mind that you can't just keep printing out that same statement and sending it to anybody for any reason. I have some more bad news. So yeah, exactly. So this webinar is not the end. Do not think that after this 40 minutes you're going to walk away and craft the most beautiful artist statement. Imagine if I were a painter and I did a webinar for 40 minutes and you went away and did watercolor for an hour and said, darn it, it's not great. You see how absurd that sounds. And this is the exact same way. Writing takes practice, preparation, and thought, especially an artist statement where you're really talking about meaningful and often slippery stuff. What you're doing as an artist is not often easy to talk about, because if it was easy to talk about it, you would talk about it instead of doing your art, right? A compelling statement takes time, and I don't care how much you write or what kind of a writer you are. It never gets easy. It takes time to do a statement that's valuable and compelling. Okay, so step one, where you practice and prepare, where you start this rehearsal process building up to your statement. A notebook or a journal or a daybook, whatever you want to call it, it's just a place where you keep what you write. Whatever format works for you. A notebook's great. If you like writing on the computer, write on the computer. I like to work with Google Docs because it's something that I can access from anywhere. If you've ever worked with that, it's my preferred methods, because if I get an idea while I'm at work, I can just click on that and just stick it in. Um, it's very useful. You can use a blog or other social media formats, but I would encourage you to think about that, because you want to take risks, you want to experiment, and that often that's difficult to do with an audience. And then finally, something I've found has worked with a lot of artists is using audio recording. You might lock up a little bit when you try to write, but if you have a recorder, I mean, most phones today have an audio recorder on them. You don't need to buy anything. You might find that you'll get some real good content out just talking out loud. So lots of places to locate it. Just find one that works for you. So what to do in this daybook, how you practice and prepare, or I use daybook, let's call it a notebook. Specifically about your work, you just, ideas. In the process of coming up with ideas, you don't have to write about work you've already done. Record everything while you're thinking about a new project. You can just free write about a concept that interests you. And the third one I think is really important. Just take notes as you're working. Um, a lot of people are afraid this will demystify the process, or it will make them too self-conscious. I think I've talked to several artists about this. If anything, it will deepen your thinking process more than it will take you away from your process. Responses to other artworks. As artists, we're always looking at people in our field. It's really helpful to write down your responses, because that language might be something you can use in your own statement. Any random idea that connects in any way. This provides both practice and content for your statement. It facilitates discovery. And by that I mean, again, it doesn't have to be in the way of your work. It can be an extension of your work. Clarify and develop your thought. Okay, what else do you put in your notebook? Prompts, and here's where I have a great selection reference for you. I'm going to have to step out of my presentation to show it to you. Twyla Tharp, the dancer and choreographer, came up with a series of questions called Your Creative Autobiography. Here it is. It's in a book that she wrote called The Creative Habit, but of course somebody has posted it online.
Can everybody see it?
Yep, it should be up on display now. I hope everyone can see it. So it's a list of 33 questions. So if you're stuck on where to start with all this stuff, here you go. Pick one and go to town. Do one a day, maybe. You have a month filled and you will have so much material. And again, you might discover a few things in the process as well. So this is very helpful. This is online. If you Google Twyla Tharp, your creative autobiography, this website will come up. Let's go back to our presentation. Sorry, it's a little clumsy. I encourage you to talk to everybody about your work. And I really emphasize non-artists. Here's the thing. We know our artwork so well. We know our own artwork so well that we think it's self-evident. And you'd be surprised how the most basic ideas, or what you see as basic, is not self-evident. It's not evident to anybody but you. And talking to somebody, especially non-artists, who's open and willing to ask questions when they don't know, will expose those areas where you thought you needed a sentence to explain it, and you actually need a paragraph. So talk to everybody about your work, and you will get lots of material from that process. Tough questions are the best, even if you don't have an answer ready for them. Use that and come at it another day in your journal. Finally, record things, conversations, walking around the gallery with somebody, um, or walking around your exhibit with a friend or an acquaintance. And again, just listen back, pull out any choice bits of language that might be useful. You'll find a lot of good stuff there as well. Okay, finally, whoops, sorry. We got a little out of control there. Read. I encourage you to read everything. Read artists, critics, interviews. Read about your subject. Say you're interested in autobiography. Read people who've talked about autobiography. Say you're interested in light. Grab a book on light. The idea here is you're going to acquire a vocabulary um, to talk about your work. See, and a reading journal, again, as you read, just write down everything you see that's valuable, interesting, copy quotes. This attentive reading will help your writing. You'll absorb through osmosis ways of writing, ways of crafting your statement, which leads us to our next part of our webinar. Your statement, structure and content. We'll look at a model statement here. So Kara Walker, African-American artist, works with silhouettes, and most of you probably looked at those statements I linked you to in the invitation. She uses overhead projectors, and that's what's happening here. So the silhouettes are on the wall. The light is being projected by those overhead projectors like you had in elementary school, or some of us may have had in elementary school. So that's an example of her work. Here's another installation shot. And let's look at the statement. Before I start on this, I do want to mention this is a pretty long statement. It's 500 words or so. Again, it's a matter of situation. It's not always appropriate to go that long, but sometimes it's perfectly appropriate. For instance, a grad school application should never be brief. They want to know some juicy information about what you're doing. Whereas when you're just sending out a portfolio to, say, a gallery cold, it needs to be brief. So, but this one's kind of long, but lots of good things happen in it, and that's why we're looking at it. So let's take a look. So opening sentence is, I carry around with me a thread of anxiety, a gnawing sense that the perception of Black women in our culture is still broadly informed by a limiting and racist stereotype, that we are feeling machines, passionate, loud, and hulking. Okay, let's just stop there. Notice how she opens. I carry around with me a thread of anxiety. She does not start, my work is about. This is something that is of vital interest to her, and we get that from that very first phrase. There's nothing wrong with saying my work is about, but as Gail was saying, if you want your statement to stand out, this kind of voice might be a nice approach to take, as opposed to kind of clinical, this is what my work is about. She goes on, what the culture anticipates from us is a thing felt barometrically rather than something comprehended intellectually. While I'm distinctly uncomfortable with narrative, that urge to correct using language and personal experience, I know that historically it is one of the few world-changing artistic outlets for women and for people of color. and so I burrowed my way into the terrain noisily, wrong-headedly. So she provides some background. She's responding to historical precedent. She's responding to certain things about the context she's in. And um, she goes on to talk about how she uses narrative. I, Anyone in the arts probably knows narrative is one of those words that you hear used in a gazillion different ways. And it's often in conflicting ways. She's very kind. She defines it for us. She stipulates a definition. She calls it that urge to correct using language and personal experience. Um, that's a very useful technique where you kind of step aside and say what you mean by a term, especially when there's room for miscommunication. Um, okay, so in the next paragraph, she talks about using drawing and cutting paper, and nods to the handmade and homespun were, especially at the time I began working, seemingly anti-conceptual techniques, but were super useful in a way of opposing a critique directed both at myself, my highfalutin attempts to engage structures of white power, and those structures of power. So she talks about her techniques and material and how they relate to both her and her subject matter. I'm sorry, there's something going on with my little side note there. She mentions drawing at the end of this and how important drawing is at the end of this paragraph as well. Just tuck that away. We'll return to that. So here's where she gets to the meat of it. First sentence, my work has always been about the distance between the perception of self and those historical structures, images, and myths that contort and influence identity. So that's really where she's, in one sentence, kind of talking about what she's about. She talks a bit more about her tools. In this case, instead of talking about how it criticizes herself and her subject, here she's talking about how it puts the audience in a certain frame. You know, the idea of the overhead, you're in school again. So she's thinking about her method and media in relationship to the audience instead of her subject and herself. So she talks a little bit more about method and media, and I'd say she might go off track a little bit in the rest of this paragraph, and that's fine. We'll talk a bit about that later. And then she returns to drawing and underscores its centrality to her work. Remember, she mentions that last sentence in the second paragraph. So, and let's look at another way you can develop your statement. So here, this is Gabriel Orozco talking about his videos. And I won't read it aloud, but here he comes up with a general idea. In his films, things are related, but through proximity rather than narrative. And then he goes on to talk about a specific work. That's a great thing that you can put in your statement. It's not always appropriate, but sometimes zeroing in on a specific work can help you articulate your concepts in a more general way. It gives you a little focus. Um, and I think it's very well put. If it's worth looking at if you haven't looked at it yet. So what I just went through there is pointed out all the ways, the things that you can talk about in your statement, stuff you can talk about. We call it methods of development in the business. So you can talk about your subject matter. You can provide background information. You can define key concepts and terms such as narrative. You talk about your methods, techniques, and materials and why they matter. A nice one to think about, and again, it has to depend on how your work is, but audience is often something to consider, how you want to relate to the audience, what's on your mind about the audience as you work. Comparisons to other artwork between your works, etc. Definitions, a history of your development, which is often very useful, especially for grad school and fellowships. The process, how you arrived at your idea. We're going to look at an example of that next. A specific work, which is what we just looked at with Gabriela Orozco. And there's one thing I wanted to put up there that's not in either or any of the statements I gave you. And this is something that will definitely set you apart. A snazzy title. Take the time to come up with an actual title for your statement. Don't call it artist statement. Call it something that gets their attention. For instance, an artist I worked with was a painter, was having an exhibit right after 9/11. So, think about that. 9/11, things on the wall with pigment. It's kind of a strange situation. And he wrote a statement called "A Strange Time to Hold a Brush." And he explored, why on earth am I doing this? Why am I playing with paint on canvas when these things are happening in the world? But that title, "A Strange Time to Hold a Brush," I thought was just pretty fabulous, and it really did set a statement apart. So, organization. So, this is an outline of what Walker did. She gave you some context and some background in that first paragraph. She talked about her techniques in relationship to both herself and her subject matter in the second paragraph. Third paragraph, she looked at techniques and materials, this time more in relationship to her subject and her audience. And then she returns to an essential technique that informs all her work, drawing. So it gives it a look. It's both working from general to specific, and she also has a circular thing going on with returning to the drawing. Um, Something about audience there. That was written for Art Forum for other artists. And it makes sense that she would end with drawing because she's talking about artistic concerns to other artists. I would say for a general statement, that might not be appropriate. That's what I'm talking about when it varies from context and purpose. Um, there's no one size fits all here. You have to think about who your audience is and what they need. But the idea with her statement is simply general to specific, very basic funnel structure, reverse funnel structure, they call it. Another example, that little statement I gave you at the end, he gives you a focus and a theme, a quick example, and how that example relates to the focus. It's a 4-sentence statement. It's the very last statement in the handout I gave you. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to look at it, but you can see what I'm talking about. Focus, example, and the connection between focus and example. Okay, I wanted to give you a break from reading statements. That's why we kind of step back and look at the methods of development. But we're going to look at another statement from William Kentridge, the South African multimedia artist, films, theater, drawings, animation, you name it, he does it. You'll recall that he talks in his the statement I gave you about how he leaves erasures visible in his drawings and in his animation. So I'm just going to play a quick clip with the audio off so you can see what he's talking about. Normal animation, you wouldn't want to leave the traces of previous frames behind, but here he does. So you see the blanket, for instance. You can see the ripples of the blanket in his suit because it's not perfectly erased. Um, I mean, the whole thing is it's a dirty drawing where he's not perfectly cleaning it up. I'll let it play a little bit more. There's one where it's even more obvious. Um, the shot of the hospital bed coming up here. Yeah, so you can see where the curtain was there. He's leaving erasure marks. Um, some people might say that's shoddy work, but he's going to talk about why he chose to do that. So let's pause. Also in that statement, he talks about how in his plays and his using puppets that he doesn't try to hide the manipulators, and you can see the image there in the upper right hand corner. That's not a rehearsal. That's how it is in the actual performance. You see the people moving the puppets. They're not hidden at all. So let's look at how he explains this need to leave the traces of his drawings behind and show the manipulators. Both the traces left on the drawings in the animated films and the double performance of the manipulator and the puppet in the theater works were born of unsolvable problems. When I began drawing, I tried very hard to make perfect erasures. I later understood that the traces left on the paper were integral to the drawing's meaning. And in the theater, we first tried a number of ways of hiding the manipulators behind screens or in shadow. It appeared to us a failure that we couldn't hide them. It was only halfway through rehearsing the first of these collaborations, what's like on the Highveld, that we realized the visible manipulators were an asset. Their presence was central to the meaning of the work. It's like another way of drawing a character. Instead of two-dimensional drawing, charcoal drawing, working through time in the film, it's like a three-dimensional drawing working through time in the play. There's a double performance. Um, And this is where I'm talking about advocacy. Let's just stay on that page. You could imagine someone walking into his Kentridge's play and going, "It was terrible. They couldn't even hide the manipulators. It was very sloppy." If you're, especially if you're not an art person, and this is where, as an artist, what I said earlier, we need to learn how to speak about our work clearly and well to any audience, and that's what he does. He actually lets us into his process and says, I struggled with this, and then I realized this is something I really needed, and he goes on to explain why. So a potential misunderstanding between himself and the audience, where someone could say, he's lazy and sloppy, he explains the rationale behind it. And that's what I mean about advocacy, bringing people into your artwork who might not get it at first. There's nothing wrong with trying to reach new audience members. If you're stuck, okay, this is the wacky part of my presentation. We're going to get a little playful here. These are things I do with some creative writing classes. If you're stuck, take an artistic approach to your writing. Play with voice or genre. With genre, I mean write in any form that you can think of. Try to write about your work as a recipe. What tools would you use? What cooking techniques? Would you boil it, bake it, saute it? Um, and how would you prepare it? Write it as a newspaper report, a Wikipedia entry, a for dummies. How would you write a for dummies about how you would make one of your pieces? I'm not saying this will become your statement. That's not the point. The idea is it's giving you a different angle at your work and helps loosen up your approach to your writing so that you generate material that you'll shape into a statement later. Assume a different character or voice or point of view. I mean, that's a fantastic exercise. Imagine what, say, a 12-year-old would say about one of your pieces. Again, you might not use any of this actual language, but it might help you unearth some things you might need to talk about. It might give you some ideas. And again, it just might loosen you up a little bit, which is always a good idea. Right, for a different audience, we've kind of talked about that. Imagine a dialogue. These are just ideas. I could keep going. A dialogue between two different people and what they would say about your work. Write a series. This I actually encourage you to try. Write an entire page of questions about your work, or you can revisit some of the methods we've talked about above. Again, here's where we get kind of wacky. I'm going to have to click out to show you some of these tools. Zara's hat, the cut up machine. That is, let's show it to you here. Oh, actually, let's. I'm going to show you how it works. So cut up machine. What this does is you plop some language in there and you hit cut it up. And what it does is it reshuffles it. This is from the Kentridge. Realized on we're born, we are working the manipulators of traces of them, meaning the left first, the I, and the A of Wozzeck. It's the we, it's two. Look through there, maybe you'll see a phrase. Manipulators, failures, understood character. You might find a phrase or an idea that triggers a thought. Go ahead.
Failure of visible.
Exactly. Again, there might be total nonsense there, but something will trigger a thought. It's playful, and you can keep clicking it if you don't get anything the first time. Again, the idea is to, first of all, generate thought, and the other idea here is to have a little fun. Don't take it so seriously. Another online writing tool that's a blast. This is an N+7 machine. This is from a poetic technique from mid-century. A group of French writers came up with this, where you take a piece of writing and you look up every noun in the dictionary and then move 7 nouns through the dictionary up. So you replace each word with the word that's 7 words away from it in the dictionary. So here's Kentridge again. Let's see what happens. And this might not work, but let's see what we get. Okay, let's look at N+7. Both the tragedy's length on the drives and the animated fires and the drawl perspective of the manipulator and puppet in The Thief were born of unsolvable producers. I mean, there's some pretty neat stuff there. Tragedies, length on the drives, animated fires. Again, the idea is to loosen you up and maybe generate a few ideas. Nothing to get terribly serious about. There's a random word generator. Really recommend that. All you do is you go to that link that I have posted at the bottom of this page. You click, it gives you an option of 1 to 8 random words. You click however many you want, and there it goes. It gives you that many words just randomly chosen. Can be a great writing prompt. Generate one word and try to see how that one word relates to your artwork. It might fail, or it might open up a very interesting new angle on what you do. Or, and what I was talking about earlier, it actually might help you come up with ideas for your own work. You don't have to see this as something outside your work. It can be an extension of your work. I know I've said it a few times, but I think it's really important. Wordle. I know this is the bane of graphic designers. You know, it's a lazy way of coming up with a quick postcard or something. So Wordle, what you do is you put the language in there, click submit, and what it does is it sorts through your document, and whatever occurs more is larger. So in here you see structures as the largest word. So that word occurred the most in this piece of writing. You can see drawing was important, racist, narrative, white, video. Um, I'll ask you, who is this? And it's Kara Walker. This is Kara Walker's statement, and it's fascinating. So she gets to see what she might not realize how important, say, language was to her, but it obviously was, and that might be something she might want to write about some more. I also am interested in the words that barely appear, such as lure. What a suggestive word. Maybe that could be something she could think about in relationship to her work, or dissonance. Um, the idea here is it helps you x-ray your work. It also will help you notice words that you use too often, which is always good. It's a good proofreading tool that way. And again, it's a fun approach that might jolt you out of a rigid block that tends to happen when we're working on these things. So again, keep in mind that this is something you'll have to adapt. A grad school application is going to be long. You're going to talk a lot about your development and how you got to where you are and where you plan to be going. Whereas an exhibit or a performance, you might have a concise paragraph on the basic idea behind the work. Um, it really requires flexibility and just you thinking about what does this audience need to know and what will be most useful to them.